This is an NPR article from August 8th. There's audio of the interview. This is NPR's Layla Fidel speaking with Professor Andrew Rudelovich, who is, again, a legal scholar, and he is going to weigh in here on these executive orders, Trump's executive order. The Constitution gives Congress the power to control federal spending, so there are legal questions hanging over at least some of the orders the president announced today. So we begin tonight with a close examination of presidential executive powers. And for that, we're joined by Andrew Rudelovich. I'm sorry, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I apologize, Andrew. He's the chair of the Department of Government and Legal Studies at Bowdoin College in Maine. He joins us now from his home in Brunswick, Maine. Okay, so Fidel asked, the key question here, Professor, is can the president act on his own manner that he did today? Rudelovich says, well, I think we can divide today's executive actions into two categories, maybe the least controversial, the payroll tax, student loans, housing. So those are the least controversial, he says, the payroll tax, student loans, housing. And there are certainly implementation difficulties with all of these. But here, the president seems to be relying on powers granted to the executive branch over time by Congress, powers that can be used in times of war or national emergency. You'll remember that back in the spring, the president issued a series of emergency and disaster declarations that helped activate these statutory provisions. So he may be stretching those a little bit. I haven't seen the text closely enough to know how exactly this is going to work or how the administration hopes. But certainly in that category, there are powers that have been delegated over time that can be activated in times of emergency. Okay. The unemployment funding, that seems to be in a different category to me, Rudelovich says. He continues, in that it is really using appropriated funds by Congress in ways that Congress might not have intended. Fidel, the interviewer, says, so does he need Congress to take action in any way to make the orders he announced a reality? Well, and Rudelovich responds, well, that would be a lot cleaner. The Constitution says that money can be only spent if it's appropriated by Congress. And indeed, in the 1970s, there's the famous Supreme Court case denying the president the ability to not spend money that Congress has appropriated. So there was a Supreme Court case that said, the president cannot withhold money that Congress has appropriated. They have to spend that money. So in terms of, where the money for unemployment benefits is going to come from, he talked about 25% of it coming from the states' shares of the CARES package that was passed in the spring. But where the other 75% is coming from, that's not known, and I would think would require congressional appropriation. And certainly the amount available to the president is unlikely to be sufficient to push those benefits too much further. Keep in mind, the president does have some authority to move money around inside the federal budget. That's a convenience. It's not likely that Congress is able to come back and shift, small amounts in the budget on a regular basis during a fiscal year. But this has been something the president has pushed pretty aggressively, maybe famously with the border wall, trying to free up cash. Again, Congress has not appropriated. So, there was the case with Trump where he tried to just shift funds around from different departments in order to pay for the border wall that he did not get congressional approval for. So this is something that if we're, going to be in favor of these things and we're going to be consistent, we got to be careful, or maybe we try to draw some finer lines around that and this is where the legal challenges will come into play because, here's how much power does the president have and do they have this authority? So we can be outraged, but if we want the president to have the authority to do what he's doing now, that means that he also technically has the authority to shift funds around for border walls. So we got to be careful in supporting some of these moves necessarily because they come with other implications. So we always have to be cognizant of that, of what are the legal ramifications of this, because we are operating within the system right now. And so we have to be aware of that. So President Trump last night said he'd probably get sued after he issued these orders. Would you agree? Are legal challenges all but certain? So that's the interviewer. Rudelovich responds, yeah, I think those are going to be moving fairly rapidly, referring to the legal challenges. Again, on the question of unemployment appropriations, it's conceivable that the Congress itself could have some standing to sue. The House sued President Obama, for example, over spending on the Affordable Care Act. I think you might see some pushback on, the payroll tax and how that's implemented. The president can defer the payroll tax, but he can't forgive it. He talked about terminating the tax, but that would certainly require a law to do that. So I think you will see pushback here. The student loan provisions perhaps are the cleanest in that there's quite a lot of emergency power built into statute as recently as 2003 to give the education department some flexibility over student loans. And in any case, you have sort of the weird situation where the people who would be most affected actually would be grateful for the relief, presumably. That I didn't quite understand. I just want to point out, he says you have this sort of weird situation where the people who would be most affected actually would be grateful for the relief, presumably. But I would think the same, but maybe not actually, because maybe that's different from the unemployment situation, because obviously those people would be grateful for the relief there. I think that they're saying that those people wouldn't necessarily be the most affected because they may get the relief, but then if those funds come out of other, areas where other people need that funding, and it's essentially, I think Trump proposed some chunk of it to come out of the disaster relief fund, the federal disaster relief fund, as well as the states. That's where he's told the states, I believe, to take their 25% from the disaster relief funds. But that doesn't, the question is, would those funds be used for people that wouldn't be the unemployed necessarily, but someone else that may be an employed person that is affected by this, by some disaster that then needs help, and they are not directly, they're not directly impacted by, say, helping, the increasing the unemployment benefit because they're not employed. So I think that's where that distinction lies. So of course, the people would be grateful for the relief in the case of the unemployment, but they might not be precisely the people that would be impacted by it. So by shifting funds from the disaster relief fund or wherever else these funds are going to come from, because we'll find out later, where else are these funds going to come from? So, all right. So again, this is not the first time. So Professor Rudelovich continues on. Again, this is not the first time presidents have messed around with administrative deadlines. Back in 2013, President Obama delayed certain deadlines that were in the Affordable Care Act. But again, since the people who didn't want to meet those deadlines were the ones who would presumably have standing to sue, they were not in a, they were not really eager to do that. They were happy with the relief. So there you have it. The people that would be the ones to sue, which would be the people that were, that would have the standing to sue. I'm sorry. The folks that would have the standing to sue would be the people whose student loan debts were being altered in some way. But since it was to give them relief, they're not going to complain. So no issue there. You don't have to worry about somebody challenging that. Whereas in the case of somebody moving funding around from, say, a disaster relief fund to pay for unemployment, there could be many people who say, hey, listen, I may face a disaster, but I'm not unemployed, and I don't want that funding being taken from my potential, safety net. And I don't like this idea. Let me just, my personal opinion on this is, I don't like this idea of us having to fight against each other. And, because it's giving this false image of scarcity where there is none. We have all the funding in the world. We just gave $6 trillion away in our last economic stimulus package. We gave away $6 trillion to the wealthiest people in the largest corporations. There was $4.5 trillion plus, they gave $1.5 trillion to the business community. And then on top of that, 450 billion of it was put in the Fed and leveraged by the Federal Reserve at a 10-to-1 ratio for corporations to borrow from. And so that is a, $4.5 trillion package there on top of the $1.5 trillion they had already received directly through the stimulus package. So they got essentially $6 trillion, but at least call it a $4.5 trillion. At the very least, it was a $4.5 trillion bailout that was just given to them. No questions asked. Nobody thought twice about that. But in the case of, providing some, economic stimulus to the, workers and just working class people that need it, no, there we got to go and we got to sit there and, pull from one working class person to go pay for another, which is, of course, going to create a situation where you create tension amongst the working class, where all of a sudden now, if you're the working person, you are now fighting against the person who is, the non-working person, the unemployed person. And so there's some, line being, some dividing line being placed there that shouldn't really exist there. So we have a comment from Mark McKeever who says, and let me just check out. So Mark McKeever says, if the tax cut is deferred and has to be paid eventually next year, how does this defund the Social Security and Medicare? I'm confused. Okay, so just to be clear on that, so Mark McKeever is saying, if the tax cut's deferred and has to be paid eventually next year, how does this defund these Social Security and Medicare? I'm confused. The point is that it would be really, really difficult to come back later, and it would be, think of you, a taxpayer, your taxes you get a tax cut. When do tax cuts like this ever work for the rich folks, right? When are their tax cuts only ever temporary and they end up paying the taxes back, a few months later? Nobody said that about any of the $6 trillion tax cut for the wealthy that was passed by Republicans in 2017, I believe it was, or 2018. Nobody thought that was not temporary. That was permanent. Those were permanent tax cuts. The Bush tax cuts, Obama made permanent. Those are permanent tax cuts. It's only when it's in the case of working class people, one, that we talk about tax cuts being temporary. So one, that's just one thing that I just red flag there. But then also, so how is it a defunding? It's because the idea would be that they would cancel that debt ultimately. Trump is saying he ultimately wants to cancel that debt. And let me just pull up the article where I believe they said that. This is from the CBS News article. You'll see that they said the payroll tax, which takes money from workers' paychecks to fund Social Security and Medicare, would still eventually be owed by workers unless there is further government action. Mr. Trump also asked the secretary to explore ways of canceling the debt. So you see, Trump has already asked the Secretary of the Treasury, Steven Mnuchin, to explore ways to cancel this debt ultimately. So they don't want this money to be paid back. The goal is to make people feel like this is a tax cut right now. So working class people will feel like, ooh, relief. Yes, that's relief for me. Now, one, it's only relief if you have a job, which is fair, fine to say, let's get some relief to people who have jobs. My plan for relief to people who have jobs is just a universal basic income. Provide a universal basic income, and then we can completely skip all of this nonsense about who's getting a $600 extra a week and who isn't. Let's give $600 a week extra to every single person in the country over age 16, whether you're working or not working. You should be getting that $600. So then you don't feel like, oh, if I go back to work, I'm going to have to take a pay cut just to get back to work. No, it's always going to be more money on top of whatever you're making already. So let me just be clear on my stance so that it's very clear that there's no conflict with my stance. But the reason why, just to be very clear to Mark McKeever, the reason why this is a defunding is because Trump has already stated his intention, which is to not have people pay back this tax cut. And so that will lead to a defunding of Social Security and Medicare. Yes. Okay. So Mark McKeever says, so this is just step one of many steps to accomplish their end game. Got it. Exactly. They would just put this in. It would leave out of people's minds in a little bit. It won't become a hot topic issue. Okay. It will feel like economic stimulus. Working class people would likely favor that, on first glance, but then the cuts would, because the damage that will be dealt, one, they plan to come back later and cancel that debt, so that money will never be repaid to your Social Security and Medicare. And then ultimately, when you finally would really realize the impact of that would not be until your retirement. So a lot of people, just young people, folks in my generation, I'm an elder millennial, folks in the millennial generation, Zoomer generation, they are looking at a very insecure retirement right now. Most of us are relying on Social Security for our retirement at this point. That's what most people don't have a pension. I don't have a pension right now. I had a 401k, and when I lost my job a couple of years back, I had to spend all, I withdrew all of it in order to cover my rent to just get me through a rough time. And so I have no 401k, I have no pension, and I'm a software engineer by profession. I was making, in my last job, $100,000 a year, and that was considered below market value. And so, and still living paycheck to paycheck and scraping by with tons of debt, because that's the way the system has been, designed. So yeah, so this is just a multi-pronged attack on our retirements, essentially. And yeah, so that's something to definitely try to keep an eye out for. And just whenever you hear things about payroll tax cuts, really what we should be pushing for is more payroll taxes. But people don't want to spend higher taxes, because right now the way the system is set up is that they don't benefit from the government the way that they should be benefiting from the government. So it feels like you're spending into this system that's not giving you back anything. And so I totally understand where the sentiment, arises from, and why some people, both on the left and the right, can sometimes, particularly on the right, have more of a resistance, a repulsion of, from taxes. It's because for a lot of working class people, the system hasn't been benefiting you directly, or it feels that way. The safety net's not there for the masses of people. We just saw it by 50 million people being thrown out of work, and about the same amount, 50 million, losing their health insurance. And so when you include their dependents and such. And so people feel like, okay, well, I'm paying tax into a system. A tax cut is an overall benefit to me, right? When really it means less money going into the system to pay for the social programs and to cover those sorts of expenses. And so in a decent society where we had a proper social safety net, it would feel fine. I would want to pay more taxes. In 1945, I believe it was, in the US, the top marginal tax rate was something like 94%. So every dollar you made over it was something like 200 something thousand in today's money. Every dollar you made over that, it would be, or I think it was $400,000 by today's money, I believe. FDR proposed a 100% tax rate, take everything. They settled for a 94% tax rate, which meant every dollar over that amount, 94 cents out of every dollar went to the government. And so we did used to have really, a much better tax rates, a much fairer tax system, but that's been gone for a long time. And so now, even the taxes that we pay, because we get paid so little, it feels like so much. And so again, I just don't want to make people feel bad for having that sort of reflex in them to feel like, okay, well, this is a tax cut for working class people, isn't it? It's for people making less than $100,000. Well, for one, there's only about a $20,000 gap between that and the cutoff for what you were putting into taxes anyway. People that were making more than 120,000 don't pay any of that money into these payroll taxes, so they don't care that much. And so it feels like a working class tax cut, but really, in the end, it's an attack on our retirements and on our social security, really. So let's just finish up this a little bit more from this article from the Legal Scholar. I think that they make a lot of great points and just stuff for us to keep in mind while this is going on, because we got to have this context and know what to expect out of this. How far will these executive orders really be upheld, and are we actually going to get this relief? Because that's all I care about at the end of the day, is what kind of relief does this mean for working class people and families? And yeah, is it real? So, and which brings me to the next point. So the interview asked, so does he need Congress to take action in any way to make the orders he announced a reality? So to which the legal scholar Rudelovich responds, well, that would be a lot cleaner. The Constitution says that money can only be spent if it's appropriated by Congress. And indeed, in the 1970s, okay, so we read through this. Sorry about that. So, okay, yeah. So just they expect the legal challenges to start to move through quickly. So we can expect that he says, I think you might see some pushback on, the payroll tax and how that's implemented. So we'll see. The president can defer the payroll tax, but he can't forgive it. He talked about terminating the tax, but that would certainly require a law to do that. So I think you will see pushback here. So we'll see pushback. I don't know if that pushback will result in the executive order being challenged and actually not being upheld. That can certainly happen. We saw with things like Trump when he attempted the Muslim ban got rejected by the courts. So certainly the president signing an executive order is not the end of the story. It still has to pass through the courts, essentially, if there's any challenges. And so we have to wait for those to be resolved. And so we'll see how if these actually make it through the courts. And the one that's most likely to receive challenges is the unemployment benefits, which I think is the one that is really going to provide the most direct relief and the most economic stimulus, in fact. And so we'll see if that's even becomes a reality. Thanks for watching Radical Democracy Podcast. I'm your host, Kamali Rose. Please like and share this video, subscribe to the channel, and if it doesn't bother you, hit that bell below to receive notifications whenever we go live or launch a new video. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if you can afford it, do me a huge favor and head over to my Patreon at patreon.com/radicaldemocracy and throw me a few bucks. Whatever you can afford, it goes a long way, and I will greatly appreciate it. It helps the channel to continue to exist and to grow, and I really appreciate the support. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon. All right. Peace. All right, that was a good one. That one's it.